She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met. He took one look at her face and sent her packing. The letter was crumpled in her hand, the paper damp from her sweat. Wilhelmina Dawson, Willa to the very few people who cared, stood on the train platform in Copper Creek, Arizona, a town that was little more than a smudge of dust and disappointment. The year was 1883. She was 23 years old with $12 to her name and a one-way ticket back to a life she'd run from. The rejection letter didn't just say no, it was cruel. Too plain, it said, too outspoken. He'd expected a meek little flower from Boston, and instead he got Willa, a woman who had opinions and wasn't afraid to voice them. Apparently asking why he'd left her, waiting on a blistering platform for 3 hours, was evidence of an unsuitable temperament. The station master had already given her his pity, a mumbled, "happens sometimes," before disappearing back into his office. The silence was heavy, broken only by the buzz of flies and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. This was it, the end of the line. She squared her shoulders, fighting the lump in her throat. She would not cry. She would not give this town, this man, the satisfaction. Then the sound of boots on the wooden planks, slow, deliberate. "Madam, you waiting on someone?" The voice was deep, laced with a local drawl that was as dry as the dirt beneath her feet. Willa turned, her spine stiff as a board. He was tall, dressed in worn range clothes that had seen better days. A leather vest over a faded shirt, dusty trousers tucked into scuffed boots. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but she could see a strong jaw covered in dark stubble. And his eyes. They were the color of a sky right before a thunderstorm. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with something else. Curiosity. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "It appears I've been left behind." The man stepped closer. The sun hit his face, and she saw the lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into this relentless sun. He couldn't be much older than 30, but he carried himself like an old soul. "You the mail-order bride for James Walton?" he asked. There was no judgment in his tone. Just a question. Willa felt the heat rise in her cheeks. The shame of it was a physical thing. "I was," she managed. "It seems Mr. Walton found me lacking." He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just nodded, his stormy eyes fixed on hers. The man took off his hat, revealing a mess of copper-colored hair. "Name's Lucas Reed," he said. "I run the Double R Ranch, about 5 miles out." "What exactly did Walton find so objectionable?" Willa let out a short, bitter laugh. "According to his letter, I'm too educated for a wife, too argumentative." She paused. "I questioned the wisdom of being left at the station for 3 hours. A ghost of a smile touched Lucas Reed's lips. "Walton's a fool," he said, and it was the kindest thing anyone had said to her all day. He glanced at her trunk, then back at her. "I've got a wagon. I can take you to the boarding house in town. You can figure out your next move from there." It was a simple offer, a decent offer, the sensible thing to do. But sensibility had gotten her abandoned 2,000 miles from home. Just as she was about to accept, the station master poked his head out. "Train back east leaves at 9 sharp tomorrow, Miss Dawson. Walton's already paid your ticket." His eyes darted between Willa and Lucas, a nervous energy coming off him in waves. Something inside Willa snapped. She had crossed a continent. She had endured the filth and the noise and the terrible food of a 3-day train journey. She had left everything she knew behind for a new life, only to be dismissed like a faulty piece of mail. She wasn't going back. Not in shame. Not ever. She turned to Lucas Reed. "I would appreciate that ride, Mr. Reed." Lucas nodded, reaching for her trunk. But as he lifted it, he shot a look at the station master. A look that was hard and unreadable. "John," he said, his voice carrying in the still air, "if anyone comes asking for her, you tell them my wife is staying at the Double R from now on." Willa's breath hitched in her throat. The world tilted on its axis. I I beg your pardon?" Lucas turned to face her, his expression giving nothing away. "Just giving you options, Miss Dawson. You can take that train tomorrow, or you can consider a different arrangement." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she and the goggle-eyed station master could hear. "I need a housekeeper. You need a place to stay. It's a simple bargain. The station master swallowed hard. You taking her as your wife, Reed? Lucas never broke eye contact with Willa. His gaze was a physical force, holding her in place. If she's willing, madness. This was complete and utter madness. Mr. Reed, we've only just met, she whispered, her mind reeling. And you just spent weeks traveling to marry a man you'd never met, he pointed out, his logic infuriating and undeniable. At least with me, you know the terms up front. Hard work, honest treatment, no surprises. What were her choices? Go back to Boston, a failure, a burden to a family that could barely feed itself? Or stay here, in this wild, unforgiving territory, alone? She looked at this stranger, this Lucas Reed. He wasn't promising love. He wasn't promising anything but a roof and a meal. He was offering survival. What would this arrangement entail exactly? She asked, ignoring the way the station master's jaw had dropped. Lucas set her trunk down. My ranch house needs managing, meals cooked, clothes mended. In exchange, you get room, board, and my protection. He paused, and his next words were crucial. As for anything else, that would be entirely up to you. I'm not a man who takes what isn't offered freely. She searched his face, his storm blue eyes, looking for a hint of a lie, a flicker of danger. She found nothing but a raw, straightforward pragmatism. He was a man who made bargains, not promises. And if I decide to leave, she pressed, her voice a thin thread, then I'll drive you to the station myself, he said, a small, crooked smile playing on his lips. Though I'd hope you'd give the double R a fair chance first. The distant whistle of a freight train was the only sound. Willa thought of the letter in her pocket, the insult, the dismissal. She thought of James Walton, who hadn't even had the courage to reject her to her face. Then she looked at Lucas Reed. He wasn't a gentleman. He wasn't offering a life of ease. He was offering a chance, an anchor in the storm. Very well, Mr. Reed, she said, her voice clear and firm. I accept your offer of employment. She took a breath. As for the other matter, I believe we should let the town think what it will, for propriety's sake. Lucas's smile widened, and a glint of respect shone in his eyes. Fair enough. He hefted her trunk to his shoulder, as if it weighed nothing. John, he said to the station master, word gets around that Miss Dawson has found suitable arrangements. We don't want Walton getting any ideas. The station master just nodded, his face a mask of disbelief. Sure thing, Reed. I'll tell folks your wife's arrived. As Lucas led her to the wagon, Willa's mind was a whirlwind. Had she just jumped from the frying pan into the fire? The wagon was sturdy, hitched to two strong bay horses. Lucas stowed her trunk and then offered her his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but his grip was warm and steady. As she settled onto the high seat, he looked at her, his expression serious. That train leaves at 9 tomorrow, he said quietly. You can still be on it. Willa looked down the dusty main street of Copper Creek. This wasn't the life she had imagined, but her imagination had led her to this very moment of desperation. Perhaps it was time to stop imagining and start surviving. No, she said, a new resolve hardening inside her. I came west to build a new life. I intend to do just that. Lucas climbed up beside her, taking the reins. The double R isn't fancy, he said, clicking to the horses. The wagon lurched forward, kicking up a cloud of red dust. But it's solid. 100 head of cattle, some horses. The house needs a woman's touch, but it's sound. As they rolled through town, she could feel the eyes on them. Women stopped their shopping. Men tipped their hats to Lucas, their gazes lingering on her. The whispers had already begun. They'll talk, Lucas said, his eyes on the road ahead. Let them, Willa replied, lifting her chin. I'd rather be the subject of gossip than an object of pity. A strange, appreciative look crossed Lucas's face. Walton really was a fool, he murmured almost to himself. The road out of town was little more than a pair of ruts, winding through a landscape that was both beautiful and brutal. Cacti stood like armed sentinels. The mountains in the distance were sharp and unforgiving against the vast empty sky. It was nothing like the gentle green of New England. It was wild. It takes some getting used to, Lucas said as if reading her mind. The land out here doesn't forgive mistakes, but it rewards hard work. He guided the horses around a bend, and a cluster of buildings appeared in the distance, nestled in a shallow valley. That's it, the Double R. It wasn't a grand estate. It was a modest log and stone house, a large barn, a corral, and a few outbuildings. It looked solid, lonely, and weathered, like the man sitting next to her. As they got closer, she saw the state of things. The paint on the house was peeling. The fences needed mending. It was a place that was being held together by sheer force of will. "You live here alone?" she asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "Just me and Pedro Mendoza. He's my ranch hand. Sleeps in the bunkhouse." The wagon rolled to a stop. As Lucas jumped down, a wiry, older Mexican man emerged from the barn. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his dark eyes sharp and intelligent. "Pedro," Lucas called out, "come meet Miss Dawson. She'll be staying with us." Pedro approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked Willa up and down, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a slow, respectful nod. "Welcome to the Double R, señorita." "Thank you," Willa said, extending her hand. The man seemed surprised by the gesture, but he took her hand briefly, a small smile touching his lips. Lucas hauled her trunk from the wagon. "Pedro's been with this land since before I bought it. Knows more about cattle than any man alive." "The boss exaggerates," Pedro said, but he looked pleased. "I will finish with the new calf, then bring fresh water for the señorita." As Pedro disappeared back into the barn, Lucas carried her trunk to the covered porch. He paused at the front door, and for the first time he seemed hesitant. "It's not much," he warned. "Been a while since a woman was in this house." Willa straightened her spine. "Mr. Reed, I grew up in a 3-room apartment with 6 other people. I'm accustomed to making do." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded and pushed the door open. The main room was sparse and clean. A stone fireplace, a heavy wooden table, a few sturdy chairs. A pair of antlers hung over the mantelpiece. It was a man's space built for function, not comfort. "Kitchen's through there," Lucas said, gesturing. "2 bedrooms down the hall. Mine's at the end. The other one's been used for storage. You can have that one." It was more than she'd had on the train platform. It was a start. "I'm curious," she said, turning to face him. "Why take in a complete stranger? You've clearly managed on your own." Lucas set her trunk down, running a hand through his copper hair. It was a gesture she was starting to realize meant he was uncomfortable. "Ranch is growing. Needed the help," he said gruffly. Then he looked away. "And I didn't like Walton treating a woman like she was damaged goods." The unexpected chivalry warmed her. "I don't require rescuing, Mr. Reed. Only an opportunity." A corner of his mouth quirked up. "Fair enough. And it's Lucas. Mr. Reed sounds like my old schoolmaster." "Very well, Lucas. And you may call me Willa." He showed her to the room. It was small, crammed with boxes, a broken saddle, and other junk. But it had a window that looked out on the mountains, and it had a bed. "I'll clear this out tomorrow," he promised. After he left, Willa sat on the edge of the dusty mattress. The sheer enormity of her situation washed over her. Just this morning, she was a mail-order bride. Now she was a housekeeper, a pretend wife to a stranger, stranded in the middle of nowhere. She started to unpack, laying her few belongings out. Her books, her mother's silver hairbrush, a small photograph of her family. She was creating a small island of order in a sea of chaos. Later, she explored the kitchen. It was basic, but it had what she needed: flour, beans, coffee, salt pork. By the time Lucas and Pedro came in for supper, she had a simple meal of cornbread and beans on the table. Lucas stopped in the doorway, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "You didn't have to do that." "I prefer to be useful," she said simply. They ate in a comfortable silence. Afterward, Pedro retired to the bunkhouse and Willa started clearing the table. "About my status," she said, not looking at Lucas. "You told the station master I was your wife." "For your protection," he said, his voice low. "A single woman living out here with me. People would talk, viciously. This way they'll still talk, but they'll mind their manners." He stood up. "In this house, you're my housekeeper, Miss Dawson. Nothing more, unless you decide otherwise." And in town, he said, his expression serious. You're Mrs. Reed. Anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. I won't have you disrespected. The fierce protectiveness in his voice startled her. It was more than she'd ever gotten from her own family. Later that night, in her small, cluttered room, she thought about the strange bargain she had made. It was a lie, a shield. But as she drifted off to sleep, she remembered the look in Lucas Reed's storm-blue eyes when he defended her. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. The next morning, Lucas was true to his word. He hauled every last crate and broken saddle out of her room, leaving her with a small, clean space that was entirely her own. He even found a small, rickety table to serve as a nightstand. It's not much, he said, standing in the doorway. It's mine, she replied, and that meant everything. The days settled into a rhythm. Willa would rise before dawn, starting the coffee and preparing breakfast. She scrubbed the small house from top to bottom, mended clothes, and took stock of their meager supplies. The biggest challenge was the garden out back. It was a choked, pathetic patch of weeds. Haven't had time, Lucas admitted, looking at it with a frown. The previous owner's wife, she could make anything grow here. The mention of another woman, a real wife, sent a strange pang through Willa. She pushed it aside. I'll see what I can do, she promised. The tour of the ranch ended on a small rise behind the house. 3 simple wooden crosses stood against the sky. The previous owners, Lucas said quietly, William and Sarah Davis, and their son. Influenza took them all one winter. He paused. I bought the place from their daughter back east. She never came back. Willa looked at the lonely graves. Sarah Davis, a woman who had made a home here and then died here. She felt a sudden, strange connection to her. This land didn't just reward hard work, it took everything. The next day they rode into town for supplies. As they approached Copper Creek, Willa felt a knot of anxiety. People will stare, she said. Let them, Lucas replied, his jaw set. And stare they did. As Lucas helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store, a big, sloppy man lounging outside the saloon hollered across the street. Hey, Reed, heard you picked up Walton's reject. Lucas went rigid, but before he could say a word, Willa put a hand on his arm. It's all right, she said, her voice clear and calm. She turned her head slightly toward the man. I'm not ashamed of being rejected by a man with such poor judgment. The corner of Lucas's mouth twitched. He turned back to the man. Mrs. Reed and I have shopping to do, Barker, he called out, his voice booming across the street. Don't you have a gutter to be lying in? The title Mrs. Reed sent a jolt through her, but she held her head high as he ushered her into the store. The proprietor, a wiry man named Simmons, gave them a knowing look. Heard you had some excitement at the depot, Reed. Lucas ignored him, handing Willa a list. While they gathered supplies, a well-dressed man entered the store. He was handsome in a soft, pampered way, and his eyes were cold. Reed, he said, with a nod that was more of an insult. He turned his gaze on Willa, looking her up and down like she was a horse for sale. And this must be the lady in question. James Walton was just telling me about your arrangement. There's no arrangement, Hargrove, Lucas said, his voice flat and dangerous. He stepped slightly in front of Willa. This is Willa. She's at the Double R now. Hargrove's thin lips curved into a smirk. So I hear. Walton's a fool for letting a woman like this slip away, though I imagine his loss is your gain. The insinuation was clear and ugly. My wife's name is Mrs. Reed, Lucas said, the words dropping like stones into the silence of the store. Hargrove's eyebrows shot up. Wife? Well now, isn't that sudden? Didn't realize I needed your approval, Lucas shot back. He paid for their supplies, his movements quick and angry. As they left the store, Willa could feel Hargrove's eyes on her back. Who was that? She asked as the wagon rattled out of town. Franklin Hargrove, Lucas said, his knuckles white on the reins. Owns the bank, owns half the town. He's also James Walton's business partner. Now it made sense. The hostility, the possessive way he'd looked at her. He and Walton are trying to buy up the water rights along the creek, Lucas continued, his voice tight. My creek, the one that keeps the Double R alive. Suddenly, this was more than a personal insult. It was a threat. Lucas hadn't just offered her a job. He'd pulled her into the middle of a war. And by calling her his wife in front of his biggest enemy, he'd just made her a target. Life at the Double R was hard, honest work. Willa threw herself into it. She revived the sad little garden, coaxing green shoots from the dry soil with help from Pedro, who, it turned out, knew a thing or two about desert plants. She made curtains for the windows, baked bread that filled the small house with a warm, comforting smell, and slowly, painstakingly, turned the bachelor's shack into a home. Lucas watched it all with a quiet, appreciative silence. He never pushed her. He never crossed the line they had drawn between them. But the line was getting blurry. They started talking more in the evenings. She learned he'd come west from Missouri at 16, a boy looking for adventure who'd found a lifetime of hard work instead. He learned about her life in Boston, about her love for books, about the quiet desperation that had led her to answer Walton's ad. One evening, she found him in the barn, working by lantern light over a sickly newborn calf. Its mother had died giving birth. Lucas was trying to get it to take milk from a bottle, his large, calloused hands clumsy and gentle. "He's not taking it," he said, frustration etched on his tired face. "May I try?" Willa asked softly. She knelt in the straw beside him. He passed her the bottle, his fingers brushing against hers. A spark, small and unexpected, jumped between them. Willa cradled the calf's head, murmuring to it, and after a moment, the small animal began to suckle. Lucas just stared. "Well, I'll be," he said, a look of wonder on his face. "He likes you better than me." "Perhaps he just needs a different touch," Willa said, not looking up. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. "You're full of surprises, Willa Dawson." "As are you, Lucas Reed," she replied. They worked together through the night, taking turns feeding the small calf they named Augustus. In the quiet, shared space of the barn, with the whole world asleep around them, the walls they had built between themselves started to crumble. The pretense of housekeeper and employer felt thin and ridiculous. They were two people, leaning on each other, fighting to keep something small and fragile alive. And in doing so, they found something new and fragile growing between them. A few weeks later, Lucas announced he had to leave for a few days. Rustlers had hit a neighboring ranch, and the men were forming a posse. "Pedro will be here," he said, packing his saddlebags. "But I don't like leaving you." Willa felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. "Be careful," she whispered. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his gaze intense. "I will." He hesitated as if wrestling with a thought. "When I get back," he said, his voice rough, "we need to talk. About more permanent arrangements." Her heart leaped into her throat. Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, riding off with a group of grim-faced men, leaving her alone with his cryptic promise hanging in the air. A permanent arrangement. Did he mean marriage? A real marriage? While Lucas was gone, Willa rode into town with Pedro. She needed to buy fabric, but really she needed a distraction. She found herself in Mrs. Abernathy's dress shop, a cozy haven of calico and lace. The plump, kind-hearted woman greeted her with a warm smile. "My dear, I was hoping you'd stop by. I have something perfect for the Founder's Day dance." She pulled out a dress of deep blue silk. It was simple, elegant, and impossibly beautiful. "I can't afford this," Willa said, her hand stroking the soft fabric. "Nonsense," Mrs. Abernathy clucked. "A man like Lucas Reed can afford to see his wife properly dressed. And from what I hear, he's never looked at another woman since you arrived. That man was a lost cause until you showed up on that platform." The words sent a flutter through Willa's chest. Was it true? Had Lucas been waiting? She let herself be talked into trying on the dress. The woman in the mirror was a stranger. Not the dusty housekeeper, not the abandoned bride. She was elegant, composed. She looked like she belonged. "He won't be able to take his eyes off you," Mrs. Abernathy said with a knowing smile. On the ride back to the ranch, Willa couldn't stop thinking. What if this wasn't just a bargain? What if this was real? The thought was terrifying and thrilling. Lucas returned 2 days later, dusty and exhausted, but safe. The rustlers had been caught. That evening after supper, The air in the small house was thick with unspoken words. Willa's new dress was hidden away in her room. Lucas sat across from her at the table, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Willa," he began, his voice low, "about what I said before I left." A sudden, violent crash from the barn shattered the moment. Pedro yelled. In an instant, Lucas was on his feet, grabbing the rifle he kept by the door. "Stay here," he commanded, his face a mask of stone. Could be the rustler's friends, looking for payback. Willa's blood ran cold. She watched from the window as Lucas and Pedro crept toward the barn, guns raised. The silence stretched for an eternity, then a loud squawk and a flurry of motion. Lucas returned a few minutes later, his expression a mixture of relief and annoyance. "Raccoon," he grumbled, leaning his rifle against the wall. "Got into the chicken feed." But the moment was gone. The fragile bubble of intimacy had burst, and Lucas didn't bring up his permanent arrangement again. The Founders' Day dance was only 2 days away, and Willa felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, with no idea if she was about to fly or fall. The day of the dance arrived, hot and clear. The entire town of Copper Creek was buzzing. Willa spent an hour on her hair, pinning it up in a style she hadn't worn since Boston. Then she put on the blue silk dress. It felt like armor. When she walked out of her room, Lucas was waiting. He was dressed in his best suit, his copper hair slicked back. He looked handsome. He looked like a man who was proud to be standing next to her. His eyes widened when he saw her, and for a moment he was speechless. "You look," he started, then stopped. "The dress is—" "Thank you," she said, saving him the trouble. "You look very nice as well." The dance was held on a wooden platform in the middle of the main street. Lanterns were strung up, casting a golden glow over the whole affair. As Lucas helped her down from the wagon, she saw him. James Walton. He was standing with Franklin Hargrove, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His eyes locked on Willa, and his face twisted into an ugly sneer. Her stomach plummeted. This was a mistake. They shouldn't have come. Lucas saw where she was looking. His hand found the small of her back, a steady, reassuring pressure. "He won't bother you," he said, his voice a low growl. "I won't let him." The music started, a lively fiddle tune. Lucas turned to her. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Reed?" he asked, his voice formal, but his eyes were warm. She placed her hand in his. He led her onto the dance floor, and the world narrowed to the circle of his arms. They weren't graceful dancers, but they moved together, finding a rhythm that was all their own. The townspeople watched, whispering behind their hands. But for the first time, Willa didn't care. "Willa," Lucas said, his voice low and urgent, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm not a man for fancy words, but these last 2 months, they've been the best of my life." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as my housekeeper. I want you to be my wife. For real." The music swirled around them. The lanterns blurred. This was it. The question she'd been hoping for and dreading. Before she could answer, a commotion ripped through the crowd. James Walton was shoving his way toward them, his face red with drink and fury. "There she is!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Willa. "The woman who was supposed to be mine! Stolen by this dirt-grubbing rancher!" The music screeched to a halt. Every eye in town was on them. Lucas stepped in front of her, a solid wall of protection. "You rejected her, Walton," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "Left her stranded. She doesn't owe you a thing." Walton lurched forward. "I changed my mind. I came back for her the next day, but she was already gone." "Shacked up with you," he spat. The accusation hung in the air, vile and poisonous. A murmur went through the crowd. Willa felt a surge of white-hot anger. She was not a prize to be won or a possession to be reclaimed. She stepped out from behind Lucas, her head held high. "Mr. Walton," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the tension. "You made your decision in a letter. You didn't even have the decency to face me. You have no claim on me. Not then, not now." Walton turned on Lucas. "And you, sneaking around, taking another man's intended. What kind of honor is that?" Lucas didn't flinch. "I offered Miss Dawson a job when she was in need. Any other arrangement has been her choice. He glanced back at Willa, and in his eyes she saw not possession, but partnership, respect. The choice was so clear, it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. This angry, pathetic man in front of her offered a cage. The steady, quiet man beside her offered a life. "Mr. Walton," she said, turning her back on him completely, "I am exactly where I choose to be." She looked up at Lucas, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I believe you promised me another dance, Mr. Reed." Lucas's answering smile was breathtaking. He offered her his arm. "So I did, Mrs. Reed." As he led her back to the center of the dance floor, leaving Walton sputtering in their wake, she leaned in close. "Yes," she whispered, so only he could hear. "What was that?" he asked as the fiddler, taking the cue, started a slow, sweet waltz. "Yes," she repeated, her voice stronger. "I'll be your wife, your real wife." The smile that lit up Lucas's face was like watching the sun rise over the mountains. It transformed his rugged features, chasing away all the shadows. "I've been half in love with you since the moment I saw you on that platform, refusing to let that fool break you," he murmured, pulling her close as they began to dance. The rest of the town, the whispers, Walton's drunken fury, it all faded away. There was only the music, and the solid feel of his hand at her waist, and the incredible, impossible truth of what was happening. They were married 2 weeks later, in the small church in Copper Creek. Willa wore the blue silk dress. Pedro stood as Lucas's best man. Mrs. Abernathy wept into a lace handkerchief. As they said their vows, Willa saw James Walton standing at the very back of the church. He watched for a moment, his face a blank mask, and then he turned and slipped out the door, a ghost vanishing from her life for good. That night, back at the Double R, in the house she had made a home, Lucas finally told her the whole truth. "I have to confess something," he said, as they sat by the fire. "The day you arrived, it wasn't a coincidence that I was at the station." Willa's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "I knew you were coming," he said, his eyes locked on the flames. "Walton had been in the saloon for a week, bragging about the educated bride he'd ordered from back east. He even had a photograph of you." He finally looked at her. "He was a fool and a cruel man. I hated him for how he spoke of you, like you were just another head of cattle he'd purchased. So when I heard he'd rejected you, I went to the station. I told myself it was just to spite him, to offer you a way out so he couldn't have the satisfaction of sending you home in disgrace." The revelation stunned her. This whole time she thought he'd been a random savior. But it was a plan, a plot, born out of his rivalry with Walton. A flicker of doubt entered her mind. Was that all she was? A way to get back at his enemy? Lucas must have seen the look on her face. He reached out and took her hand. "That's what I told myself," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it was a lie. The truth is, Willa, the moment I saw you standing on that platform, so proud and defiant, with fire in your eyes, it had nothing to do with Walton anymore. It had everything to do with you." He squeezed her hand. "I wanted you for my own, but I knew I couldn't just say that. I had to earn your trust. I had to give you a choice." All the pieces clicked into place. His careful respect, his slow courtship, his patience. It wasn't just decency. It was a strategy, a campaign to win her heart. And it had worked. That night, she didn't go to her small room at the end of the hall. She stayed with him, in his room, in his bed. And in the quiet darkness, their marriage truly began. It wasn't a bargain anymore. It wasn't a pretense. It was real. It was a love born not from a letter or a contract, but from a shared glance on a dusty train platform, a defiant act against a cruel man, and the slow, steady work of building a life together, against all odds. Their first year of marriage was a blur of hard work and quiet joy. The Double R began to thrive. The garden produced so much that Willa was able to sell the extra vegetables in town. Lucas's herd grew, and he was finally able to hire 2 more ranch hands. The house, once so empty and silent, was now filled with the sounds of life. And then, one crisp autumn morning, Willa realized their small family was about to get a little bigger. Lucas's reaction was everything she could have dreamed of. The stoic, quiet rancher, who rarely showed emotion, actually whooped with joy, lifting her off her feet and swinging her around before setting her down gently. His eyes filled with a new, fierce tenderness. Their daughter Sarah was born the following spring, with a shock of her father's copper hair and her mother's determined spirit. Holding the tiny baby in her arms, looking at Lucas's face, so full of awe and love, Willa felt a wave of contentment so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This was the life she was meant to live. Not the one her parents had planned, not the one James Walton had offered and then snatched away, but this one, the one she had built, step by painful, beautiful step, with the man who had seen her at her lowest and offered her not pity, but a chance. On their second anniversary, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors. Sarah was asleep inside. "Do you ever think about him?" Lucas asked quietly. "Walton?" "Yeah." Willa was silent for a moment. "Sometimes, I think about how different my life would be if he hadn't sent that letter." Lucas slipped his arm around her. "I'd have found you anyway," he said, with a certainty that startled her. "Even if he'd married you, I'd have found a way. I never would have let him keep you." The confession, so raw and possessive, sent a shiver down her spine. The story she had told herself, of a chance encounter and a lucky break, was wrong. This was never a story about chance. It was a story about a man who saw what he wanted and refused to let anything, or anyone, stand in his way. He hadn't just saved her from a bad fate. He had chosen her, and every day since, he had kept choosing her. She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the first stars appear in the vast Arizona sky. Her journey had started with a brutal rejection, but it had led her here. To a home, to a family, to a love as rugged and real and enduring as the land itself. If you enjoyed this story of unexpected love and frontier justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next strange, dark, and mysterious tale we have for you.